So, we're gonna deep dive The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. I'm making this in hindsight of the lesson, and I can assure you that you'll definitely find some value in these lessons. This book is provocative, to say the least. What most people don't understand, this book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, is not about apathy, indifference, or withdrawing from life. It's about something much harder: choosing what actually deserves your care. Because you don't get to stop caring. You're always gonna give a fuck about something. The only question is whether the things you are investing your intention, anxiety, and effort into are worth the cost. The core argument of this book is deeply counterintuitive. Mark Manson argues that the more we chase positive feelings like happiness, confidence, success, validation, the worse we often feel. And that real improvement usually begins when we stop trying to feel good all the time and instead learn to tolerate negative experience. This isn't a motivational book, it's a book about values. It asks different questions than most self-help. It's not going to ask you what you want or how to eliminate problems or how to feel happy. It's going to make you question yourself, what is worth wanting in the first place? Which problems were worth solving? And what kind of suffering actually leads to a meaningful life? There's 9 different lessons in this book. You can follow along as we go through them, or you can bounce around in the timeline, whatever draws your attention. But we'll directly be questioning happiness, values, entitlement, responsibility, certainty, actions, saying no, and finally death. The goal isn't to care less about everything. The goal is to stop spending your limited care on things that can't justify it, so you can invest it fully in what actually does. And to understand that, we have to start where the book begins, and with an idea that immediately contradicts most self-help advice. The first lesson of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is the backward law and what not giving a fuck actually means. The first lesson sets a philosophical foundation for the entire book, and it immediately contradicts most self-help books. Mark Manson's opening claim is simple but unsettling. Trying too hard to feel good often makes people feel worse. The pursuit of constant positivity doesn't eliminate suffering, it amplifies it. This idea is rooted in what Manson calls the backward law. The desire for positive experience is itself a negative experience, while the acceptance of a negative experience is itself a positive experience. The more intensely you chase happiness, confidence, or success, the more you reinforce that feeling that you don't have them. And that gap between where you are and where you think you should be is where dissatisfaction grows. Most people fail to grasp this lesson because they operate under a cultural assumption that feeling bad is a problem to be solved immediately. Discomfort is treated as a malfunction. Anxiety means something is wrong. Sadness means life is off track. So when a negative emotion shows up, people don't just feel them, they panic about feeling them. They feel anxious about their anxiety, ashamed of their sadness, frustrated that they're frustrated. This creates what Manson later calls a self-reinforcing emotional spiral, where the original pain is no longer the issue, the reaction to the pain becomes the problem. At that point, people stop trying harder, they consume more advice, they search for hacks, affirmations, routines, and mindsets that promise to eliminate discomfort entirely, but this effort to escape negative experience only sharpens awareness of its presence. You don't stop feeling bad, you start becoming hyper-focused on the fact that you shouldn't feel bad. This is where the pursuit of positivity quietly turns into a form of resistance against reality. Manson reframes the issue by challenging the assumption that negative experiences are inherently bad. He argues that negative emotions are not flaws in the system, they're signals. They evolve for a reason. Dissatisfaction motivates change. Fear promotes caution. Frustration highlights obstacles. Trying to ease these signals don't lead to health. It leads to confusion and stagnation. The backward law explains why so many people feel stuck despite doing everything right. If you so desperately want to be confident, every moment of insecurity becomes evidence of failure. If you desperately want to be happy, then every neutral or difficult day becomes proof that something is wrong with you. If you desperately want to be successful, then every setback becomes an existential threat. The act of trying to feel better becomes the very thing that keeps reminding you that you don't. Acceptance, in contrast, doesn't mean resignation. It means removing the extra layer of judgment. When negative experience is allowed to exist without panic, it often becomes manageable. When pain is acknowledged instead of resisted, it loses some of its grip, which is why Manson opens the book with the command, "Don't try." Not because effort is bad, but because effort directed at controlling your emotional state often backfires. In the book, Manson illustrates this with variations of the same pattern across different domains. The more someone wants to be rich, the poorer they feel because their attention is constantly fixed on what they lack. The more someone wants to be admired or desired, the more inadequate they feel because every interaction is filtered through the question of whether they're being validated. Every spiritual pursuit falls into this trap. The more someone tries to be enlightened, the more self-absorbed they become, constantly monitoring their progress and comparing themselves to an imagined ideal. In this case, the pursuit of positive state reinforces awareness of the negative ones. Manson's point is that not improving is impossible, but that improvement starts in a counterintuitive place. It begins by allowing the current state to exist without attempting to immediately escape it. Many of the lessons in this book are misinterpreted, especially this one. You read, "Don't try," and you think that it promotes passivity or nihilism, and it means stop caring or stop acting. That's not what Manson is saying. He explicitly rejects indifference. You cannot give a fuck about something. Even apathy is a form of caring. It's caring about not caring. The real choice is not whether you care, but what you care about. Not giving a fuck doesn't mean being emotionally numb. It means being comfortable with being different, with not meeting external expectations. It's not in tolerating discomfort in service of something more important. Manson introduces 3 clarifications that define this properly. First, not giving a fuck does not mean being indifferent. It means being comfortable with being different. Second, not giving a fuck about adversity. You must give a fuck about something more important than adversity itself. Third, whether you realize it or not, you're always choosing what to give a fuck about. This reframes the entire book. The goal is not to eliminate caring, it's to narrow it. Once this lesson lands, it changes how people relate to their inner experience. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" the question becomes, "What is this feeling pointing to? And is it worth engaging with?" Anxiety no longer automatically means something is wrong. It might mean you're doing something that matters. Frustration no longer means failure. It might mean you're encountering resistance on a meaningful path. Discomfort stops being evidence of incompetence and starts becoming evidence of involvement. This shift removes urgency without removing responsibility. You still act, you still improve, but you stop demanding that improvement feels good. And once you stop trying to escape negative experience, something subtle happens. You regain energy. You no longer are fighting yourself. The emotional noise quiets, not because you're forcing it to, but because you stopped amplifying it. This lesson establishes the first major inversion of this book, that negative experience is not the enemy of a good life. It's often the entry point. So if negative emotions are unavoidable and even useful, that raises a deeper problem. If life inevitably includes discomfort, frustration, and pain, then the real question isn't how to avoid them. The real question is which ones are worth having. The second lesson is why problems never stop and why that's the point. If the first lesson dismantles the idea that negative experience should be avoided, the second lesson dismantles something even more sacred, the belief that happiness is the neutral end goal of life. Manson's claim here is deliberately provocative. He argues that happiness itself becomes a problem when it's treated as a permanent state to be achieved. Not because happiness is bad, but because life does not work that way. People have a hard time with this lesson because they assume that progress means eliminating problems. There's an unspoken belief that if you just fix enough things, your finances, relationship, your health, life will eventually stabilize into something smooth and enjoyable. This assumption is reinforced consistently. Advertising suggests that products solve problems permanently. Social media presents curated snapshots of people who appear to have arrived at a problem-free life. Even self-help often implies that there is a final level where anxiety fades, confidence locks in, and struggle stops. So when problems persist, as they always do, people interpret that persistence as failure. They think something is wrong with them. They assume they're falling behind. doing life incorrectly. This creates a quiet form of despair. You ask yourself, why am I still unhappy if I've done everything right? Manson reframes happiness not as a destination, but as a side effect of solving problems. And because problems never disappear, happiness can never be permanent. Life, he urges, is an endless sequence of problems. When you solve one, another replaces it. Not because you messed up, but because that's the structure of existence. You solve your money problems by making more money, and suddenly you have new problems. Now you're burdened by how you're going to manage it, how you're going to maintain your lifestyle, and how to protect what you've built. This isn't a mistake, this is upgrade. The mistake is expecting the absence of problems to ever arrive. This leads Manson to one of the book's central conclusions. Happiness comes from solving problems, not from having none. But there's a catch. If happiness comes from problem solving, then which problems you choose become far more important than how good you feel in the moment. The subtle art introduces the idea of the hedonic treadmill to explain why happiness remains just out of reach. No matter what improvement you make, your expectations rise alongside it. You think a new house will make you happy until it introduces new stress. You think a relationship will complete you until it exposes your emotional shortcomings. The emotional baseline resists, the mind adapts, satisfaction will fade. This isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Evolution favors creatures that are slightly dissatisfied because dissatisfaction drives action. A human who is content forever will stop improving, stop adapting, and stop surviving. Negative emotion then is not an error, it's fuel. Everyone wants the rewards, but very few choose the struggles consciously. A very common misinterpretation of this lesson is that it's pessimistic, that it suggests life is nothing but suffering or that happiness is meaningless. That's not what Manson is arguing. He's not saying happiness doesn't matter. He's saying happiness is unreliable as a value. It fluctuates, it adapts, and it cannot guide long-term decisions. If happiness is your primary metric, you'll constantly abandon commitments when they become uncomfortable. You'll leave relationship when conflicts arrive. You'll quit pursuits the moment they feel hard, and you'll confuse emotional discomfort with evidence that something is wrong. The point is that meaning, not happiness, is what sustains people through difficulty, and meaning comes from engaging with problems. There's a simple implication of this lesson. Instead of asking, how do I become happy, the question becomes, which problems do I want to wake up with every day? This reframing quietly filters your choices. If you don't enjoy the daily frustrations of your career path, then you probably don't actually want the outcome. No matter how attractive it looks from a distance, if you aren't willing to tolerate the emotional work of a relationship, you don't truly want intimacy. You want validation without cost. And if you want the benefits of health, but resent the discipline it requires, you're valuing comfort over vitality. This lesson encourages people to stop fantasizing about outcomes and start examining process, because the process is the real life, not the reward at the end. Happiness, when it appears, is a byproduct of forward motion. It emerges when solving problems you respect, not while waiting for discomfort to end. Once you accept that life is defined by problems and that the quality of your life depends on which problems you choose, a new obstacle appears. Because many people don't just choose bad problems. They believe they shouldn't have problems at all. And that belief quietly turns into entitlement, which is why the next lesson strips away a dangerous illusion, the idea that you are special, exceptional, or exempt from the basic rules of life. The third lesson is exposing entitlement and the illusion of exceptionalism. By the time Manson reaches this lesson, he has already dismantled two assumptions: that negative experience is something to avoid and that happiness is something to permanently achieve. The third assumption is he's targeting something more personal and something more uncomfortable. The belief that you are somehow exempt from an ordinary life. This lesson is not meant to insult the reader. It's meant to expose a quiet psychological trap that fuels dissatisfaction, resentment, and stagnation. People struggle with this lesson because entitlement rarely announces itself as entitlement. It often disguises itself as self-esteem, uniqueness, or even suffering. Most people don't consciously think I deserve special treatment. Instead, entitlement shows up as expectations that life should be smoother by now, that success should have arrived earlier, that pain should have been lighter, or that others should have recognized their effort more. When reality doesn't match those expectations, frustration follows. And rather than questioning the expectations themselves, people conclude that something has gone wrong, either with the world or with themselves. This creates a subtle emotional tension. I shouldn't have to deal with this. Manson frames entitlement as the belief that you deserve positive experience without accepting the negative experience required to earn it. It's the expectation of reward without sacrifice. He illustrates this through two forms of entitlement that appear opposite but function the same way. The first is grandiose entitlement. I'm amazing, therefore I deserve more than others. The second is victim entitlement. I'm uniquely broken or disadvantaged, therefore I deserve more than others. One believes they're above the hierarchy and the other believes they're beneath it, but both share the same underlying assumption: the rules shouldn't apply to me. Behaviorally, the result is identical. Both forms lead to self-absorption, blame, and avoidance of responsibility. Both orient the person around their own emotional experience rather than reality. There's a few examples of this that Manson illustrates in the book through people that he's encountered who consistently sabotage themselves while believing they're owed better outcomes. They feel deeply wronged by the world but resist the discipline, humility, and patience required to improve their situation. He connects this to modern culture's obsession with exceptionalism. Social media advertising and even self-help messages constantly reinforce the idea that everyone is special or destined for greatness. The problem, Manson argues, is that exceptionalism is emotionally unhealthy. When everyone is told they're exceptional, ordinary struggles to feel like a normal life. This belief inflates expectations, while reality remains unchanged. This creates a permanent gap between how life is and how it's supposed to be. A frequent misinterpretation of this lesson is that Manson is promoting low self-worth, or that you're not special and you don't matter. That's not his point. Manson isn't saying your life has no value. He's saying your life has value precisely because it's ordinary. Meaning is not found in being exceptional. It's found in responsibility, effort, and commitment to something outside your ego. He contrasts empty affirmations with what he calls eating your vegetables. Accepting mundane truths like the fact that most of your life is repetitive, unglamorous, and unnoticed, and that it's not a problem. Believing you're not special isn't depressing, it's stabilizing. Once entitlement dissolves, a subtle psychological shift occurs. Life stops feeling unfair and starts feeling negotiable. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me, the question becomes, what do I do next? This lesson removes the emotional inflation that turns normal obstacles into personal crises. You stop interpreting every setback as evidence that something is wrong with you or the world. You'll start to see struggle as the default, not as a punishment. And when struggle is no longer framed as injustice, energy that is previously spent on resentment becomes available for action. This is why Manson positions this lesson where he does. Without dismantling entitlement, responsibility feels cruel. Without entitlement removed, responsibility feels empowering. Once this illusion begins to fade, a new question emerges. If struggle is inevitable and if no one is exempt, then suffering itself needs to be examined more closely, because not all suffering is equal. Some pain builds meaning, other pain destroys it. The difference between the two has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with values. Lesson 4 targets the value of suffering. Manson has cleared the ground. He's removed the expectations of constant happiness, dismantled entitlement, and reframed struggle as inevitable. Now he turns to the most important question that follows from all this. If suffering is unavoidable, what makes some suffering meaningful and some pointless? This lesson marks a structural shift in the book. The earlier chapters tear down false assumptions, but from here on, Manson builds on a value system to replace them. There's a struggle to understand this lesson because people assume that effort alone gives suffering meaning. They believe that if they work hard enough, push long enough, or sacrifice enough, the outcome must be worthwhile. But effort without direction doesn't mean meaning. It creates exhaustion. Many people suffer intensely for goals they never consciously choose. They endure stress for status they don't actually care about, anxiety for approval they don't need. And when that suffering doesn't produce fulfillment, they don't question the value itself, they question themselves. Manson argues that values are the filter that determines whether suffering is constructive or destructive. Discipline, motivation, intelligence, and resilience are natural traits. They amplify whatever you're attached to. If they're attached to a bad value, they don't save you, they trap you. He illustrates this with the story of a Japanese soldier who continued fighting World War II for decades after the war had ended. The soldier was disciplined, loyal, and relentless, but those virtues were chained to a false belief. His suffering didn't create meaning, it prolonged delusion. The lesson is stark. Having the wrong goal makes even your best qualities dangerous. To clarify how values work, Manson distinguishes between good values and bad values. Good values share three traits. They're reality-based, socially constructive, and immediate and controllable. The bad values are the opposite. They rely on superstition or illusion, and they're socially destructive or self-centered, and they depend on things you cannot fully control. Manson contrasts values like honesty, responsibility, and commitment with values like popularity, wealth, or constant happiness. The difference matters because values determine where your effort goes and what kind of pain you tolerate. Manson here isn't prescribing a universal set of correct values. He's offering criteria, not commandments. This book does not tell you what to value. It teaches you how to evaluate what you value. A value isn't good because it sounds noble. It's good because it holds up under pressure. If a value collapses the moment it causes discomfort, it was never a value, just a preference. This lesson quietly changes how people interpret their own pain. Instead of asking, why does this hurt, the question becomes, what value is being challenged right now? If the pain stems from a value you believe in, growth, responsibility, integrity, then the pain is not a signal to quit. It's a signal that you're engaging with something real. If the pain stems from a value that feels hollow, like status, comparison, or ego protection, then the pain is revealing a misalignment. In this way, suffering becomes a diagnostic. Rather than something to escape, pain becomes feedback about whether your life is organized around values that can sustain. Once values are defined, another problem shows. Because even when people know what they value, they often behave as if they have no choice, trapped by circumstances, history, or by other people, which leads to the next turning point. If values determine meaning, then choices determine responsibility. And Manson's next claim is one of the most uncomfortable in the entire book. You are always choosing, whether you admit it or not. Fuck yeah. Lesson 5 dials in on responsibility as the source of power. Up to this point, Manson has shown that suffering is inevitable and that values determine whether suffering has meaning. Manson's claim here is blunt and deliberately uncomfortable. You are always choosing. Even when it feels like you're trapped, unlucky, or forced, this is the moment where the book stops being abstract and becomes personal. People resist this lesson because they confuse responsibility with fault. They hear, you're responsible, and it assumes this is your fault, which feels cruel or unjust, especially in situations involving trauma, bad luck, or other people's wrongdoing. So instead of engaging with responsibility, people reject it outright. They focus on blame, who caused the problem, why is it unfair, why they shouldn't have to deal with it. But blame doesn't move life forward, it anchors attention in its past. And while fault may explain why something happened, it does nothing to resolve what happens next. Manson draws a sharp line between fault and responsibility. Fault concerns the origin of a problem, responsibility concerns your response to it. Something can be completely not your fault and still entirely your responsibility. So he illustrates this with a thought experiment. If someone places a newborn baby on your doorstep, you didn't cause that situation, but you are now responsible for deciding what to do. Ignoring the baby because it's not your fault doesn't remove the responsibility, it just guarantees harm. The same applies to illness, loss, betrayal, or disadvantages. You may not be responsible for how these things entered your life, but you are responsible for how you interpret them, how you act on them, and what they become next. This distinction is the foundation of the lesson. In the book, it explains the marathon thought experiment to show how choices alter the meaning of pain. If someone is forced to run a marathon under threat, the experience is traumatic. If someone chooses to train for a marathon and then runs it, the pain is nearly identical, but the meaning is completely different. What changes wasn't the suffering, what changed was the perception of choice. Manson's argument is that even when choices feel absent, it still exists. At the levels of value, you may not choose the circumstances, but you choose what matters more in that moment. You choose whether survival matters more than comfort. You choose whether integrity matters more than approval. Choices don't disappear just because the options are bad. People listen to this lesson and think Manson is minimizing real hardship, and that he is suggesting people simply choose to be happy or choose better circumstances. He's doing neither. He explicitly rejects the idea that choosing responsibility means denying or pretending pain. Instead, he argues that acknowledging responsibility is what makes pain workable. Responsibility doesn't remove suffering, it gives it direction, which without responsibility, suffering becomes passive. With responsibility, suffering becomes actionable. Once this lesson is internalized, the psychological posture of life changes. Instead of asking, whose fault is this, the question becomes, what am I going to do about it? This shift collapses procrastination, resentment, and helplessness into a single point of agency. When you accept responsibility, you stop waiting for circumstances to approve or for someone else to fix things. You begin acting immediately because now there's something you can do. Manson frames this as the source of real power. With great responsibility comes great power. Not power over others, but power over your own behavior and actions. Once responsibility is accepted, another fear surfaces. Because taking responsibility means admitting you might be wrong. If you're responsible for your beliefs, your decision, your value, then certainty becomes dangerous. Lesson 6 explains why certainty is the enemy to growth. Here, Manson introduces a second constraint that responsibility brings with it. If you are responsible for your beliefs and choices, then you must accept the possibility that you're wrong. This lesson is not about self-doubt for its own sake. It's about recognizing that certainty, especially certainty tied to identity, is often what prevents people from improving their lives. People fail at this lesson because certainty feels safe. Being certain gives a sense of control, it stabilizes identity, and reduces anxiety. If you believe you've already figured things out, then you don't have to confront ambiguity. Ambiguity. If you believe you've already figured things out, then you don't have to confront ambiguity or risk being wrong. But that safety is deceptive. Certainty often protects the ego, not truth. And the more something is tied to identity, politics, morality, or self-image, the more violently people defend it, even when evidence suggests otherwise. So instead of revisiting beliefs, people double down. They avoid information that threatens their worldview. They surround themselves with reinforcements, and they make the mistake of confidence for accuracy. Manson's central claim is that being wrong is not a failure, it's evidence of learning. He invites the reader to reflect on how many things they believed 10 or 20 years ago that now feel embarrassing or naive. That discomfort isn't proof of failure, it's proof of growth. If your current beliefs never become outdated, it means you stopped evolving. From this perspective, uncertainty becomes productive. It creates space for adjustment, humility, and better decisions. Manson argues that rigid certainty traps people in outdated versions of themselves. In The Subtle Art, it contrasts historical certainty with modern humility. People once believed the earth was flat, that disease were caused by evil spirits, or that certain social hierarchies were natural and permanent. At the time, those beliefs felt obvious. They were defended with conviction, but time exposed their flaws. Manson then applied this to personal life. He points out that the most psychologically unstable people he's encountered often possessed the most certainty. Their beliefs were rigid, unchangeable, and emotionally defended. Certainty didn't ground them, it isolated them. The book introduces Manson's law of avoidance. The more a piece of information threatens your identity, then the more likely you are to avoid it. People don't avoid information because it's false. They avoid it because it threatens who they think they are. A common misinterpretation is that Manson is promoting relativism, that nothing is true or that all beliefs are equally valid. That is not his argument. He's not saying truth doesn't exist. He's saying your access to truth is always incomplete. Uncertainty is not denial, it's openness. It's the willingness to revise beliefs as new information arises. Manson is advocating for intellectual humility, not confusion. Once certainty loses its grip, several behavioral shifts occur. People stop defending beliefs and start examining them. They listen instead of waiting for a response. They become more flexible in relationships, and they take feedback without interpreting it as an attack. Instead of asking, how do I prove I'm right? The question becomes, what would it look like if I'm wrong? And would that actually be worse? Manson offers 3 diagnostic questions. What if I'm wrong? What would it mean if I were wrong? Would being wrong create a better problem than the one I have now? These questions reframe uncertainty as an opportunity rather than a threat. Once you accept responsibility and uncertainty, another illusion collapses. You can no longer wait for perfect clarity before acting, because clarity comes after action, not before. Lesson 7 focuses on how action creates motivation. At this point, Manson has removed nearly every psychological excuse for staying stuck. If you accept responsibility, admit uncertainty, clarify your values, one final obstacle remains: the belief that you need confidence, motivation, or certainty before you act. This lesson dismantles that belief completely. People fail at this lesson because they wait. They wait for readiness, they wait to feel confident, they wait to understand themselves better. And while they wait, nothing changes. This waiting is often justified as reflection or self-awareness, but Manson frames it more bluntly. It's avoidance, disguised as preparation. Fear of failure doesn't usually stop people outright. What stops them is the belief that failure means something about who they are. So instead of risking a visible mistake, they choose invisibility. No action, no outcome, no proof, and no growth. Manson's framing is not as the opposite of success, but as the mechanism through which success occurs. If negative experience leads to positive growth, as established earlier, then failure is not an interruption to the process. It is the process. This leads to one of the book's most practical principles. Action precedes motivation, not the other way around. Most people believe that they need motivation in order to act. Manson argues the opposite. Motivation is a reaction to action. Movement creates clarity, effort generates confidence. Waiting to feel motivated is like waiting for strength before lifting weights. This is illustrated in what's called the do something principle. When you don't know what to do something, anything that moves you slightly forward. He traces this idea back to a simple classroom rule. If you don't know how to solve a problem, rewrite the problem. In rewriting it, the first step often becomes obvious, then the second, then the third. The action itself reveals the path. Manson applies this principle across his own life. When overwhelmed, he didn't aim to solve the whole situation. He aimed to take the smallest possible step. Walk towards the person, write one paragraph, take one action. Each action created feedback, and each feedback reduced uncertainty. Each reduction in uncertainty made the next action easier. Manson isn't glorifying reckless action or mindless productivity. The principle is not do everything, it's do something. Action is not meant to replace thinking, it's meant to generate information. Failure in this context is not collapsed data. If an action doesn't work, it narrows the field, it tells you what not to do. That alone is progress. This lesson changes how people relate to fear. Fear stops being a signal to wait and becomes a signal to move. Instead of asking, what if I fail? The question becomes, what will I learn if this fails? People stop trying to avoid embarrassment and start tolerating it. They stop protecting identity and start building skill. This applies across multiple domains. In work, it encourages experimentation over perfection. In relationships, it encourages honest communication over silent avoidance. And in personal growth, it encourages iteration over paralysis. Once action becomes a priority, motivation stops being scarce. It emerges naturally from momentum. Action creates momentum, momentum creates consequences, and consequences require boundaries. which leads us to the next lesson. Once you start acting on your values, you're forced to decide what you'll accept and what you won't. Lesson 8 emphasizes the importance of saying no. This lesson does not restate those ideas that we've previously covered. Instead, it answers a narrower question. If you know what you value, how do you make those values real in the presence of other people? Manson's answer is simple and uncomfortable: by saying no. This chapter is not primarily about boundaries, conflict, or assertiveness. Those are secondary effects. The real problem Manson is targeting is non-commitment. People want the emotional payoff of meaningful values without paying the structural cost of choosing one thing over the other. They want direction without exclusion. They want identity without sacrifice. Saying no is where that fantasy collapses. Manson reframes rejection as a necessary mechanism of meaning. To value something, by definition, it's to reject alternatives. So values only exist when they exclude. If nothing is rejected, nothing is prioritized. You can't value a relationship without rejecting others, a career without rejecting other paths, and a principle without rejecting convenience. Trying to avoid rejection doesn't preserve freedom, it dissolves it. When everything is allowed, attention fragments. Identity becomes unstable, life fills with shallow commitments that never deepen. Manson's key insight here is that commitment simplifies life. Once you choose what matters most, many decisions stop being decisions at all. They fail here because they fear irreversibility. Saying no makes choices real. It closes doors, it removes plausible deniability, and once a choice is real, responsibility can no longer be postponed. Responsibility can no longer be postponed. So people stay vague, they hedge, they keep other options open, not because they're indecisive, but because they want to avoid being wrong in a visible way. When Manson applies this to a relationship, his point is precise. A healthy relationship is not one without conflict, but one where both people can state limits without fear of abandonment. If you never risk disappointing someone, you never learn whether the relationship is resilient. Without boundaries, trust is impossible because nothing is ever being tested. Conflict isn't the goal, clarity is. The mistake readers make is here they'll start to assume that saying no is about dominance or emotional distance. It isn't. It's about alignment. Saying no doesn't reduce care, it concentrates it. It removes the noise so effort can be directed somewhere that actually matters. This lesson changes how commitment is evaluated. Instead of asking, do I like this? Does this make me happy? Does this keep my options open? The question becomes, what am I willing to exclude for this? If a value can't survive exclusion, then it was never a value. It's just a preference. Once values are chosen, responsibility accepted, action taken, and commitment made, one constraint remains that no amount of clarity can escape. Every choice is temporary. Every commitment exists under a deadline, which is why the final lesson doesn't offer advice at all. It offers perspective. The 9th lesson is placed in the last chapter of the book. And this chapter has had such impact on my own personal life that I have the title, "And Then You Die," tattooed on my body. The final lesson does not introduce a new framework, it removes the last illusion. Manson ends the book by confronting the one condition that applies to every human life equally. It ends. This chapter is not about fear, it's about clarity. Throughout the book, Manson has been narrowing the reader's focus, reducing what deserves attention, stripping away false priorities, and forcing difficult choices. This final lesson completes that narrowing process. Death acts as the ultimate filter. It exposes which values were real and which were distractions. It reveals whether effort was spent deliberately or scattered. It clarifies what mattered and what never did. Manson's argument is not that death gives life meaning in some abstract sense, but that awareness of death forces honesty. When time is unlimited, avoidance is easy, but when time is finite, everything unnecessary becomes obvious. People resist thinking about death because it threatens identity and control. Morality reminds us that no amount of success, certainty, or recognition grants exemption. So death is pushed out of awareness. It's treated as morbid, pessimistic, or irrelevant to daily life. Manson argues the opposite. Ignoring death makes people live poorly. When morality is ignored, priorities drift, energy gets wasted on status, resentment, and comparison. Decisions are postponed. Commitment remains half-formed. People assume there will always be more time to become serious later. Death interrupts that fantasy. Manson frames death as the most reliable tool for value clarification. He describes how encounters with morality, whether through loss, danger, or reflection, tend to instantly recognize priorities. Petty concerns collapse, trivial conflicts lose their emotional charge, and what remains is what actually matters. Not what feels good, not what looks impressive, but what would feel incomplete if left undone. This is why Manson draws on thinkers who emphasize mortality as a discipline rather than a threat. Reflecting on death is not meant to depress, it's meant to focus. The central insight of this chapter is that your values are only as real as the sacrifices you're willing to make before time runs out. Everyone claims to value certain things, but when viewed through a lens of morality, many of those claims dissolve. If you had 1 year left, what would you stop pretending mattered? What obligations would you drop immediately? What relationships would demand honesty? And what work would feel non-negotiable? These questions aren't hypothetical. They expose the values already operating beneath conscious thought. The most common misunderstanding is that this chapter is about urgency, about rushing, panicking, or trying to maximize experiences before death. That's not Manson's point. He's not advocating for squeezing more into life. He's advocating for removing what doesn't belong. Death doesn't demand speed, it demands precision. It forces you to recognize that meaning does not come from accumulation, but from alignment. When morality is acknowledged, decision-making changes. People become less concerned with how things appear and more concerned with whether they matter. They tolerate less nonsense, they invest more deeply, they stop negotiating with values they know they'll eventually regret abandoning. This awareness doesn't eliminate fear, but it strips fear of its authority. Fear loses power when you realize that avoidance doesn't protect you from loss. It just guarantees regret. This final lesson does not contradict anything that came before it. It validates it. Negative experiences matter because life is finite. Responsibility matters because time cannot be returned. Uncertainty matters because certainty is an illusion. Action matters because delay is costly. And commitment matters because you cannot live every possible life. Death doesn't add meaning to life, it reveals it. And with that, the book closes not by offering answers, but by leaving the reader with a question that cannot be outsourced. Given that your time is limited, what is actually worth giving a fuck about? Fuck yeah.